Let's talk about decision making in the operating room. I think that's really what separates truly excellent surgeons from others. And one of the big topics these days is preservation rhinoplasty. I've talked about it a lot myself. And I think that, one of the keys to understand is that it's not the right thing to do in every single patient. And I have a number of concepts around this that I've talked about over the past couple of years at meetings internationally. And so I want to just talk about one of them right now. And it's called the dorsal septal gap concept. So the septum comes up in the middle of the nose and meets the bridge, but it doesn't always meet in the center. And so even though the nose may look symmetric, underneath the septum may be hitting at one side or the other. Why is that important? Well, in a standard hump reduction, when you cut the bridge of the nose, you have a dorsal septal gap on each side. That's part of the open roof. And it has to be closed. Another thing to understand is that nasal bones, once you've done cuts on them, osteotomies, whether it's with a piezo or a standard osteotome, they like to fall in. They don't like to fall out. And it's very hard to keep them out. So if you have a dorsal septal gap that is uneven, and then you do osteotomies, even though the nose looks symmetric beforehand, one side's going to want to fall in more than the other, and the nose is going to look crooked. And so you have to do some things to try to mitigate that, like spreader grafts and things like that. And so the patient might wonder, why is my nose still wide? I wanted it to be narrower. And so this is one of the things that'll cause a problem. And if you don't do it, you're going to have an asymmetric nose. So the dorsal septal gap is a key concept. And that's why preservation is nice in those cases, because in those cases, you're actually bringing the whole bridge down right on top of it, and you don't have to worry about any dorsal septal gap issues. The other situation where it is important to consider, and this is when you're trying to decide between preservation or standard hump reduction, is whether the dorsal septal gap actually can work for you or against you. What do I mean by that? Well, if the nose is deviated, for example, to the right, and the dorsal septal gap is wider on one side or the other, it could make it favorable or unfavorable for conventional hump resection. Remember, the bones like to fall inwards. So if we are deviated to the right, we want our nasal bones to go to the left. And in that case, we want to have a larger dorsal septal gap on the right side so that bone will fall towards the left. And so in those cases, using conventional hump resection can work. How do you know before you take the hump down? Well, when you do a bony cap reduction and you're looking at the cartilaginous vault, before you've cut into it, you still have your choice whether you want to do a conventional hump resection or preservation. You can actually determine whether it's the case or not with your caudal elevator or something like that. In cases where it's unfavorable, you may want to go ahead with preservation. Those are cases where the septum is deviated towards the side, the nose is deviated high up underneath, and there's no dorsal septal gap on that side. In which case the nasal bone will not fall in, the opposite side will want to fall in more, and you'll end up with an even more crooked nose. Those are definitely cases where it's better to do preservation if you can. And all of this is meant to optimize the results for our patients. 15, 20 years ago, we didn't have these choices available to us by and large. So again, as we become more advanced in our surgical procedures and we have more choices, our ability to make choices and make good choices is what will separate us as excellent surgeons from those who are not. I hope that helps.